Hello and welcome to my Research to Practice project presentation. My name is Kayla Wright-Soler, and an issue in education I would like to address is the lack of funding in schools. In this presentation, I will discuss the benefits of increased funding and how to achieve it, my multi-step plan on how to address it, and my solutions to solve it. So what are the impacts of underfunded schools? Well, there are three major impacts I will address that are directly affected by the issue of underfunding in education. Firstly, schools are understaffed, and as you know, there is a major teacher shortage in this country. So there are several reasons for that teacher shortage that I will address in a minute. Second impact I will address is student success and outcomes. How can properly funded schools promote student success and positive outcomes? And lastly, I will address how funded schools can positively impact students' well-being. Understaffed schools are a major issue facing education today and can be seen throughout the country in thousands of school districts. The state of California, for example, is among 4 outlier states in the country whose total pupil to teacher ratio exceeds 22 to 1. In the 2017-2018 school year, the national average was 15.8 per teacher. That same year, California's ratio was 22.7 to 1. Understaffed schools lead to teachers being overworked and underpaid and unable to meet the needs of their students. With larger class sizes, educators are unable to meet the needs of their students because they're not able to give their time to them, especially those with specific learning disabilities, even English language learners, and those who require additional support with specialized skills and trained knowledge. In addition, students who face significant challenges in their lives outside of school, like trauma or homelessness, are our most vulnerable population, and they will be impacted the most by these teacher shortages. In order to keep up with the needs of students, as well as the ever-changing curriculum that educators face, educators need professional development in order to strengthen their classroom instruction. However, many districts report very few instructional days, sometimes upwards of 4 instructional days for teachers to do planning time, strengthen their skills, have non-instructional days that are essential for teacher planning and collaboration. Same with professional development and time to refine their skills and improve their abilities. Another school condition that affects teachers' effectiveness and support are personnel on campus. Examples of support staff on campus can include special education staff, specialists that provide necessary services to students with high needs, coaches, librarians, academic counselors, social workers, bilingual resource teachers, and nurses, just to name a few. Students with extra learning needs, such as those with disabilities or ELL, require additional support and can best be served by educators or support staff. Now, these positions are essential for the success and well-being of our students across the country because they help them so well. Lastly, teacher salaries and benefits account for the majority of public school spending. However, many educators take on a second job in order to support their families because their yearly salary can be so minimal. As a result of both state disinvestment and lack of funding in the teaching profession, many states are suffering from teacher shortages and having to rely on emergency credentialed substitute teachers. While a lack of funding impacts teachers in many ways, students can also feel the burden. Funding is a crucial aspect in providing a quality education, and without it in the education system, it cannot improve itself. Funding can supply students with proper supplies, informative curriculum, trained and knowledgeable educators and staff, access to resources to improve and develop their learning, manipulatives, and more. Without them, students will not be able to effectively learn or become motivated to stay in school and not drop out. They also form vital relationships, and this is essential for their learning. And they also socially and emotionally develop to the best of their abilities this way. Through increased funding, schools can get more resources and funding into educational programs. And these programs can encourage students to focus more on educating themselves and closing the student achievement gap. Students can also graduate high school and go on to college and also become more productive members of society. in terms of getting jobs and having money and paying taxes as well. It is important to realize that putting more funding and resources into early childhood education programs can help students become more successful and productive, as well as well behaved when out of school. Money can have several effects on a student, starting from a young age, and impact their future mental health, income, and success. Students can spend at least 7 hours a day at school, and those who participate in after-school activities or programs spend even more time at school on campus. So it's important that we prioritize their education and do all that we can to fund their education so that they can learn to the best of their abilities. One of the greatest effects of increased funding for schools is how it impacts student well-being and their cognitive abilities. Students with mental health issues and learning disorders often face challenges when it comes to learning and core discipline, and we see that as teachers ourselves. This is in part because they may not have proper accommodations due to funding. Schools can provide students with proper care to meet their needs or have higher support staff that can give proper training and address these students with high needs, and also create spaces such as wellness rooms for students to receive appropriate services and interventions as needed. Mental health disorders are related to higher dropout rates, and can affect classrooms and how students interact with one another, as we see in education as well. By funding appropriate services for these at-risk students, educators and support staff can maximize success and reduce possible negative impacts. Furthermore, school personnel can receive appropriate and vital training in order to help our most at-risk students. These three major impacts lead me to my 4-step plan to increase funding for our public schools in the United States. Step 1 is to raise taxes at the state level to provide more funding for education. The American education system relies heavily on state and local resources to fund public schools. At the state level, responsibilities are mostly concerned with administration and standards, while at the local level, districts are charged with the task of carrying out those funds and having those duties that are given to them by the state. Because most of the funding for public schools is done at the local level, the funding system contains widespread disparities in school finances in thousands of districts across the United States. This is because the local sources of revenues on which school districts heavily rely upon are often distributed in inequitable ways. A hefty share of local education revenues come from property taxes, which innately favor wealthier communities because they have a much larger capacity to raise funds based on higher property values. In comparison, low-income communities have lower property taxes, which means that their local funding is not as profitable for their public schools. This being said, raising taxes at the state level to provide more funding for our public schools rather than relying on local funding to raise funds for public schools will ensure a more equitable funding system. This also means that schools serving students with greater needs will receive more resources to meet the needs of those students before schools with a lower concentration of disadvantaged students. Step 2 is to rely on state funding rather than local funding. Like I said earlier, state funding of public education is typically the largest budget line item for most states. State funding is expected to make up for local funding disparities and gaps, as well as offset some disparities caused by dependence of local revenues. This is important for low-income, high-poverty areas. Step 3 is state funding prioritizes low-income and high-needs schools. This includes students who special needs, those at risk, so on and so forth. School districts in high poverty areas which serve larger numbers of students of color often get less funding per student than other school districts in low poverty areas which predominantly serve white students. This highlights the education system's inequity. These schools consistently lack resources like basic school supplies to meet their needs. By prioritizing funding for these schools, we can provide students in the United States with quality education and even work towards closing the achievement gap at a faster rate. The last step, step 4, is to raise money at the local level. As I said earlier, public education is funded at the state and local levels. If we complete steps 1 through 3, Raising money at the local level can provide extra funds for schools in ways such as extracurricular activities, school programs, additional resources like technology, which some low-income schools do not have access to, manipulatives for math and science, VAPA education, and more. By raising money at the local level, we can broaden students' education and allow them to experience more than just the traditional curriculum. It is important to note that while these steps would be a massive undertaking and require years of effort and work, the results would be valuable and beneficial for all students in America. Now, how can we measure the success of my plan? Well, there are 3 criteria I will use. The first thing we will see are higher numbers of educators and support staff within the next decade coming back to the profession. By properly funding schools, more people would be willing to enter the profession again, and this will lead to smaller class sizes, which allow teachers to give more one-on-one support for students as well as more support for their families and communities. It's a win-win. The next thing we would see are higher graduation rates. Students unable to receive proper care for their needs are at high risk of dropping out. As of 2020, the dropout rate for all students was 7%. While that's not a large percentage, our goal is to prevent any and all dropouts. Increasing school funding and in turn spending improves student outcomes such as test scores and graduation rates, college attendance, so on and so forth. The last indicator would be increased salaries and benefits for educators. As I mentioned earlier, teacher salaries and benefits account for the majority of public school spending. Going hand in hand with indicator 1, increasing funding for schools will in turn increase salaries and benefits for educators. As I addressed in my plan, the importance for adequate and equitable funding in schools is important and vital for the success of our future in our country. Our children are our future, and proper funding will only benefit our students. As educators, we are passionate about our students' futures, so proper public school funding should be a priority. My plan lays out just a few ideas of how to increase funding for K-12 public schools and how our government can reinvest their funding into our schools. For far too long in our country, we have normalized the practice of underinvesting in our education while still expecting schools to function well, teachers to teach effectively, and students to receive a quality education. We must build a strong foundation, one with sufficient, adequate, and equitable funding to ensure students can succeed and have a brighter tomorrow. Thank you for taking the time to listen to my presentation.